Hey everybody, hi, my name is Onepeg. Yeah, just like the title and the thumbnail says, I have 700 hours in Dune Awakening as of this review, and counting. I know you're wondering how that's possible, so let me explain. I was a member of a closed beta test and joined that closed beta test around April of 2024. Outside of my normal content creation hours, making YouTube videos and streaming and all that other stuff. By the way, I stream on Twitch. I don't know if you guys knew that I stream on Twitch, but yeah, I do. I stream on Twitch like every day. Anyway, throughout that time, I've amassed over 500 hours in game between the beta playtest client, a prior build of the beta playtest client that doesn't even exist on Steam anymore, where I clocked a couple of hundred hours, the beta preview weekend, and then obviously the launch on July 5th. As of the recording of this video, I have something like 122 or 125 hours since the 5th of July, and I haven't even played for a couple of days in that time. Yeah, it's been crazy. And the game has seen a lot of stuff in that time period and a lot of changes, none of which I can speak of regarding the closed beta because of a non-disclosure agreement. LOL. If you are somebody that follows this channel, the NDA joke hits way differently as of late, doesn't it? Anyway, Dune. Okay, I'm going to go through just about everything that I can here and give you an honest opinion on everything that the game does right and everything that I think the game doesn't do so right. And there's quite a bit of both. I have a lot of feedback that I've already given the devs regarding how the game is currently played, and I think my criticisms are pretty valid. Fair warning to everyone here for the critiques that I have, some of this may not apply to you, depending on the type of player that you are. So for context, I myself am someone that enjoys being in the deep desert, patrolling, engaging in PvP combat, and smashing in the occasional base. I also have a group of about 15 people that I was able to put together for launch that comprised of both experienced people from the beta that I kind of trained up, as well as brand new folks who had never played this game before launch at all. But by this point in time, have been able to experience the vast majority, if not all, of the game loop. Also, prior to having any group experience, I also have done over 200 hours of time as a solo player. So I do have perspective on both sides of this. So for those of you wondering, there will be a little bit of each in here. Anyway, on to the rest. Dune Awakening is based on the planet of Arrakis, made famous by the library of Dune books, TV series, movies, and video games originally written by Frank Herbert. The Herbert family has carried on the senior writer's vision with a series of ongoing pieces of written and visual lore, some of which has been met with some pretty harsh critique. Regardless, Funcom, the producers of this game, worked alongside the Herbert family on the adaptation of Arrakis to create Dune Awakening and filled it with some of the most iconic scenery and characters that they could muster from the Dune universe of media. So, if some of you are looking at this game or have been looking at this game and have seen things that seem a little canonically weird, just understand that the Herbert family was involved in this every step of the way and have given their blessing on everything that is in this game. Now, I'm not going to spoil anything, but aside from Paul Atreides, whom does not exist in this world, which we have all seen in previews, chances are you're going to see some extremely familiar faces throughout your travels in this game. Oh, yeah, and the whole Paul Atreides thing, you won't see him in this game because this Dune takes place on a parallel timeline in which Paul never existed, like a timeline that Paul foresaw in one of his visions where he was never born. And you are instead left to pursue this timeline to its finale, whenever and however that happens. You, meaning your character, are an awakened, someone that was brought out of cryosleep and sent down to the surface by a Bene Gesserit mother to uncover what has happened to the Fremen, who have gone missing and are believed to have been exterminated by the Baron Harkonnen. Oh, yeah, and for those that don't understand the lore of Dune, you've never really seen anything about this, Arrakis is made up of this purple dust in the sand called spice. Otherwise, it's basically a desert planet that is basically just the poop of giant sandworms that will eat you if you venture out into the sand too much, but it is used to power interplanetary travel and gives people that inhale or ingest it relatively superhuman abilities, including the ability to see things that they shouldn't, have visions, and perform other interesting feats. It is the most valuable substance in the known universe, and it is only found on Arrakis. Two of the great houses, House Atreides and House Harkonnen, are attempting to gain control of Arrakis for themselves because whomever controls the spice becomes ridiculously rich and has overwhelming amounts of influence. Anyway, before you get sent off into the world, you have to choose from one of a few different classes. Trooper, which is central to ranged heavy weapon assault style of damage, throwing grenades and the like. Bene Gesserit, which messes with people's minds using a mental ability called the Voice, which is similar to the use of the Force in Star Wars. A Mentat that calls in a support drone-like turret and lobs poison at people. And a Sword Master, who prefers to be up in people's faces with a blade duking it out as opposed to ranged weaponry. Once chosen, you get thrown onto Arrakis after crashing on the planet and have to figure out everything as you go. In terms of lore accuracy and adaptation, Funcom nails this one down. It is a 9 out of 10, if not more. The world feels incredibly immersive, the voice acting is absolutely fantastic, the cutscenes give you a sense of belonging, and the story's varied twists give you some really great punchy wow moments that you'd want from a story as beloved as Dune has been over the years. But Dune at its core is a survival game, meaning that you have to manage your hydration for fear that you could run out of water, dehydrate, and die on the sand, and you also have to manage how much sun exposure you get, and you have to build a base, and for the most part craft everything you need to survive. For example, clothing that you craft helps to stave off the heat and the sun, but will not prevent you from getting heat stroke and losing water very rapidly. In addition to building bases, you also need to harvest resources, craft armor, weapons, and vehicles, some of which fly, and some of which not only fly, but carry other vehicles to other destinations. Also, like any other survival game, there are several, 6 to be exact, tiers of building of items. You begin with a copper tier, graduating to iron, then steel, aluminum, duraluminum, and finally plastanium. Again, I don't want to spoil much here for those that want to explore and discover things on their own, but the progression system is very robust, in my opinion. You have to make active choices in terms of what items you want to unlock in each tier, which require intel. Intel is unlocked via leveling, and by finding it scattered throughout the planet's surface in various specific locations. In order to unlock this next tier, let's say to go from iron to steel, for example, you have to obtain a certain number of intel points to progress in what you can learn to create, meaning that you have to unlock a certain number of points in each prior tier in order to get into the next one. This game loop is done on what is primarily, and primarily I mean a 95% PvE only area called Southern Haga Basin. Now this is also a PvP game, but I will get to where and how that goes more in a minute. For what I've described above, there is also an abundance of missions that take you all over Southern Haga Basin and to other places where you learn about the world and what's been going on here, in addition to a main story quest that has dozens of steps over 2 separate chapters with more story to come in future updates. If you were someone that didn't want to look up any guide content for any of the things I've mentioned previously and want to experience this game for yourself, there is easily, just in what I've mentioned alone, 100 hours worth of content to experience, build upon, and explore. In fact, during the beta period, because there weren't any guides like I've been trying to provide to the community, I clocked 100 hours before I learned that there was an entirely separate zone, and really, there are several. Once you make it to a certain point in the game, you start to find these trading posts, and inside these trading posts, there are pilots that you can pay to take you either to other trading posts on the Haga Basin map that you've already been to, or you can have them take you to one of the 2 capital cities. For Arrakis, it is Arrakeen, and for the Harkonnen, it is Harko Village. For 2500 Solari, you can pay the pilot to take you to either one of these cities, for example, where it acts as a larger social hub. Now you're probably wondering what I mean by larger social hub, which means at this point I kind of have to explain how the server structure works. Dune Awakening is broken up into worlds, and historically we would look at that as like individual servers, but it's more than that. Each world in Dune Awakening is comprised of several Southern Haga Basin servers that they refer to as sieges. Siege is like a giant city that's underground that the Fremen live in the Dune universe. But each one of these servers has 25 Haga Basins in them. So there is one big world made up of 25 sieges. Each one has a population of approximately 50 players. So each world is comprised of approximately 500 concurrently online individuals. Arrakeen and Harko Village work as social areas for everyone on all of these separate sieges to get together in one large location, either to socialize or in some cases trade or obtain missions and what have you. Now, once you're able to unlock flying in this game, meaning you're able to craft your very first ornithopter, you can then zone out of Haga Basin the traditional way. No longer do you have to pay a pilot in order to travel. Now, instead, you have the ability to leave the map on your own. And this takes you to a larger overworld map that allows you to travel between these locations by hand. This also allows you to travel to the game's endgame area, called the Deep Desert. And for anyone that is familiar with Dune and the movies or the books, you know that the majority of Arrakis is basically just open sand. Large, massive, sprawling sand dunes with rocky areas kind of in between. And this area, again, comprises all of these sieges to allow people to meet all together in one giant space like this one. The Deep Desert is an 81 square grid, 9 by 9, that is made up of squares that are approximately 7 kilometers squared. That makes up a map. The total size of the map is approximately 576 square kilometers. It's big, real big. And each one of these grid squares is server meshed with the intention that the Deep Desert is able to accommodate all of the gamers on all of the sieges in Deep Desert simultaneously spread out between all of these grid squares that are server meshed. The one hitch is that aside from the starting off area where you have kind of this cliff face that you can kind of jump off of and go down into the sand dunes, is that the entirety of Deep Desert is one giant free-for-all PvP area. The catch, though, or the carrot, if you want to think about it this way, is that Deep Desert has not only the biggest and baddest challenges, but also has all of the highest tiers of gear, rare and unique blueprints, and control points that you would want in order to be able to win the Landsraad. Now, I know you're wondering what the Landsraad is. For those of you that don't, I will explain it. Just let me finish this bit about the Deep Desert first, okay? PvP in the Deep Desert is pretty cutthroat, but the PvP in general compared to some other games is really not nearly as bad. For people that are used to cutthroat PvP style of survival games, let's say like Rust, this is nowhere near as brutal as Rust. Something like Rust, if you get killed, your entire inventory is lootable and usually looted in its entirety. You don't even get to keep the rock that you had in your inventory if there was one. In Dune's case, if you die, whether it's to PvP or PvE, for the most part, you keep just about everything that you had on you. Any equipped weapons or armor or other pieces of gear lose about 10% of their durability when you die. But if you are carrying certain things like rare blueprints or money, that stuff all drops on the ground in a bag, free to be looted by other people. But for the most part, the stuff that really matters to you that you wouldn't really want to lose, that stuff doesn't get dropped when you die. Instead, you take a durability hit and you drop a portion of the materials that you had been carrying in your bag on the ground. This is, of course, assuming that you aren't eaten by the worm, because the only way to lose everything in this game that you are wearing at the time would be to be consumed by Shai Hulud. If the worm eats you, they take all of your stuff, and you are left with a worm tooth and an option to be able to get a sand bike from a spirit advisor or something that you wake up and talk to while you are in the in-between. Other than that, you are relegated to your tighty-whities, and you have to go back to your base with your head hung low. But even when you feel like you're moving kind of fast, it takes a while to get across places in Deep Desert. It takes several minutes to get around. But the interesting thing about the Deep Desert is that the Deep Desert changes every week. In the lore of Dune, there are these very, very large sandstorms called Coriolis storms. When a Coriolis storm hits, the wind is so big and great that it changes how the desert looks. So every week on Tuesday morning, usually, first thing in the morning, at least for my server anyway, somewhere around 3 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on Tuesday morning, the entire Deep Desert changes. And this is by design. All of the points of interest and the bases that you had built to try and get certain materials and whatnot, little farm spots and all this and that, all of that moves around. The bases that you built in Deep Desert all get destroyed, completely wiped off the map as if they never had existed to begin with, and all of the points of interest are reshuffled, and the fog of war over the map gets brought back, which means on Tuesday morning, you have to go out and discover it all over again. The idea behind this is to encourage people to get out there, discover stuff, find where all the valuable things are, relay that back to their own guild, or in some cases, make active maps of where all the good stuff is and try and sell it to other players on the market. Oh yeah, I should also mention there is a player market that is usable by the entirety of the player base for the world in which you reside, located in each one of the faction's capital cities, but those two markets don't mix. So if you really want to see what's available for each side of things, you have to go to both. A little side note here, I realize that this might feel cool from a design perspective for lore and immersion, but in terms of trying to access the market in a meaningful way when it's already kind of shrunk, given how many available players there really are to try and sell things to other people, the market doesn't really work. From what I can gather, there's really only a couple of handfuls of guilds that in each server cluster actually end up doing an awful lot of farming for the end game. This seems like one of those things that would be much better off on a much larger scale than only, say, 500 to 600 players. I feel like this is one of those features that wasn't really thought out as well, given it's not really an economy of scale, but that's something I guess they'll have to flesh out later. This brings me to my PvP-ended discussion of the Deep Desert and how PvP works. In Haga Basin, there really aren't that many PvP areas, just really around the downed ships and a couple of other small POIs located on the map. But when you get to Deep Desert, just about everything is a PvP area. The problem is that just like the normal sand in Haga Basin, if you end up walking out in the sand, eventually you're going to attract a sandworm. The same is true for the Deep Desert, which means that if you want to get anywhere in the Deep Desert, you have to fly there. The game doesn't allow you to learn how to sandwalk like you would see in the books or in the movies or the TV series, so you have to fly. Also, the spice that you end up generating in the game, while there is a small amount in Haga Basin, almost all of 90+% of the spice that you're going to get in the game is going to come from Deep Desert. A Haga Basin spice bloom is like 500, 600 sand, somewhere around there. In the case of the Deep Desert, a medium-sized spice bloom is around 10,000, where the very, very large ones are well over 100,000. In order to collect all of this spice sand, the best way, even though it isn't necessarily the most efficient, is to use what's called a harvester, which we refer to as a spice Roomba. It kind of looks like those ball collectors that you see at driving ranges on golf courses. Anyway, in order to get one of those out to one of these larger spice blooms, you have to bring it out there with a transport ornithopter, all of which costs an abundance of very, very much endgame material and takes a very long time to accumulate. We estimate somewhere around 40 man-hours or so worth of spice gathering and plastanium material gathering in order to make the vehicles just to be able to gather even more spice at one time. Obviously, during all of this, you have escorts and ornithopters with rocket pods running defense and everything else, trying to collect all of this spice inside of your spice Roomba. The development idea here was obviously to create a dynamic event that was player-controlled a la sandbox games, where you now have a point of interest that's being dynamically created by other players. And on paper, it actually makes a lot of sense. Create a player-oriented, player-started event in which you have to defend or attack the guys that are trying to do all the collecting. But there are two primary issues here. The first is that even though the game has you doing the majority of the first 100 hours or so, getting out of your vehicle and running through events, bases, labs, dungeons, whatever, on foot, utilizing your skills and abilities that you learn through the game's various and very robust and very balanced, I might add, talent trees, almost all of that gets thrown completely to the aside in favor of flying vehicles with rocket pods that ends up being the majority of the PvP in Deep Desert. Also, if you know what you're doing, while you can get to the Deep Desert, honestly, within, say, 15 hours on the outside, if you know what you're doing in the game as a solo player, the vast majority of this game, as the end game goes, is something that you really want to be doing in a group, at least in the case of larger scale PvP anyway. You can absolutely outfit yourself after a considerable amount of time with endgame weapons, gear, armor, and vehicles as a solo player. You can absolutely pull this off. It's just going to be significantly slower, and you are going to be significantly more vulnerable. But most all of the PvP that I have seen comes from people learning how to pilot their ornithopters, whichever size it is that they choose that's not a transport, because transports don't get weapons, to try to blow up the other person with the rocket pods that they are carrying and out-piloting their target. Only after you have succeeded in disabling the ornithopter that you are targeting and it plummets to the ground where the pilot suddenly jumps out, do you have an opportunity to be able to jump out yourself and engage them in head-to-head on-foot combat. The problem is that none of that is easy. In downing the other ornithopter, you're better off just taking your own ornithopter and either blowing it up with the guy in it, or if the guy gets out, you just rocket the guy on the ground to kill him and save yourself the trouble of having to engage in a melee fight. Now, there is the off chance that you have the ability to fight someone inside of one of the points of interest, the labs or the downed ships or whatever, or the caves that somebody may end up venturing into, but almost always that turns into a camp fest where you're waiting inside of one of these facilities for somebody to show up in hopes that you can stab or shoot them. I don't want to say it's impossible for you to be able to pull off things on foot, because there are surface to air missiles, for example, that you can fire out of rocket launchers, which I'm actually going to be making an endgame weaponry guide on later on to talk about some of the things that you really want to focus on getting. But failing a couple of one-off items that have the ability to take out vehicles if they're close enough to you to even allow you to do that kind of thing, or if you're really cheeky, you could try to surf on the back of an ornithopter, let's say, and use one of those shoulder-mounted rocket launchers to be able to do some work. But in the traditional PvP sense, you're kind of stuck piloting an ornithopter with rocket pods. That's pretty much it. And for that, you're significantly better off in numbers, just like anything else. You can have teams of up to 4, but your guild can have 32 people in it, which means that if you can be relatively coordinated, you could be bringing out teams of 6 or 8 to just overwhelm and dominate everyone else that's going to be traveling around on the map. And while the devs had intended to have this large dynamic kind of knockdown drag out multiple flying vehicle fight that looks really, really cool, and we've had a couple of very small opportunities to do so, 99% of the time you don't ever see PvP of that scale. It's almost always a solo or a duo of Ornies flying out to a point to try and mine some minerals or get some spice, and then they just turn around and run when they see you get close enough to try and hurt them. Which brings me to my next issue. The PvP damage that you're doing from the ornithopters is not very great. Even scout ornithopters have a pretty good amount of hit points. They tend to tank a lot of damage. Scout rocket pods do somewhere between 150 to 250 damage per rocket, but the majority of the stuff that you end up hitting ends up having hit points in the 1,000 to 2,000 range, which means to take out a pair of wings, you have to hit somebody in that wing with a rocket 3 to 4 to 5 times, depending on what you're hitting and where, for the ornithopter to lose that wing. That means that even though rockets stack up to 250, you have to burn 30 to 40 just to take out an aluminum ornithopter. Even if you end up getting very, very high grade stuff like a tier 6, a plastanium rocket pod that does the most damage that you're going to see on a scout, or the most damage that you would see on an assault ornithopter, when you are fighting stuff where it takes 20 to 30 to 40 rockets to disable it just to knock it out of the sky, and then those players have rocket boosters and other things to try and get away from you, it ends up being much more defensively oriented in terms of success rate than offensively. The point here is it doesn't feel balanced. Also, from a shoulder-mounted rocket launcher perspective, the shoulder-mounted rocket launcher does anywhere from 3 to 4 times more damage than a standard ornithopter rocket. The problem becomes that aside from one unique recipe that we have found so far for a rocket launcher that actually allows you to lock onto your target as long as they're within 150 meters and stay within 150 meters during the duration of the rocket's flight path, none of the other rocket launchers lock onto their target. They're all dumbfire. So unless you have the ability to get the unique blueprint that makes a rocket launcher that allows you to lock onto your target, the rest of the rocket launchers are kind of worthless unless you're firing at a target that's parked. There are also lasguns, or these large laser-mounted cannons that run off of your battery pack that do unspeakable amount of damage in a very short amount of time, but those only have an effective range of 80 meters, half of the distance of a rocket, which again means that you have to basically be on top of something in order to take it out. And for people that prefer to be foot soldiers, none of this feels good. On-foot PvP can be rewarding, but you have to use the right skills, and just like everything else, there are meta builds for certain things. If you are sniping, for instance, the hit registration where you're aiming actually feels pretty good. But if you're a Bene Gesserit, let's say, that uses Bindu skills, which are more of the assassin style of skills, like Rogue Shadow Step, for instance, that is Weirding Step. Weirding Step kind of sucks. In PvE, it hits really readily. You aim at a target, you end up winding it up, you blink to your target, they get stunned, you can stab them in the back. It works great. In PvP, because of the ping disparity that exists, the hit registration on something like that fails 90+% of the time. It's not worth using. This kind of miss issue is true for a bunch of other skills as well, like knee charge or Shigawire claw, although the claw being more hit scan hits a lot more readily than the other ones do, but more often than not they tend to miss wide and they hit the ground, or they hit a wall behind your target, or they whiff entirely, or they just go sailing by someone. In fact, when you use these skills, the camera, in the case of knee charge for instance, ends up being so off and janky that it starts looking like you're going to miss, if only then to have the camera bounce back. Like you blink backward going, oh, it actually hit after all. There also is this intermittent issue where when you use something like knee charge, you don't pull out your knife or your sword right away. There's like this delay where you're waiting for it to appear so that you can do a power strike on somebody. And the list here, unfortunately, tends to go on and on. Even with all of that being said, though, the game's PvP is actually really fun when you end up getting in engagements. But it's all centralized around these giant POIs. Laboratories, spice fields, downed ships, islands of endgame materials, etc., including these control points that have to do with the Landsraad. The last piece of this puzzle that I haven't mentioned has to do with what's called the Landsraad, which in lore terms is kind of like this meeting of all of the great influential houses and the sub-houses to vote on which faction is capable of gaining control of the Landsraad for a certain period of time. Now, in the case of Dune, this had to do with being able to invoke certain types of policy. People that were voted upon in the Landsraad were able to change how the rules went, if you want to think about it that way. In the sense of Dune Awakening, this allows a buff to be placed on the faction that wins each week, either Atreides or Harkonnen. There are 25 NPCs scattered throughout the map that give you different tasks that have to be completed. Some of these unlock over time, where they show you what the task is going to be each separate day, and others yet have the ability to be bribed by paying them 300 spice melange. And they will want a wide variety of things. Kill certain NPC bandits, loot different types of things and bring it to them, craft vehicles, craft parts, craft weapons, and each thing that you do has a certain point value. When you reach 70,000 points for that individual NPC, whatever it is that they want you to do, you win that square. There are two ways to win the Landsraad, like a tic-tac-toe style of thing where you get 5 in a row, either vertically, horizontally, or diagonally, or if those squares are blocked off by the opposing faction, you can then win by having more squares than the other guy. Winning multiple weeks in a row becomes more and more difficult because there is a catch-up mechanic for the opposing faction that lost to be able to win the next week or the week after that, because they get bonus points for the same tasks versus what the winning faction has to do. For example, let's say Harkonnen lost week 1, and in week 2, one of the squares says to hand in aluminum ingots. For each one handed in, let's say for Atreides, it ends up being like 2 points. Because Harkonnen lost the week before, their hand in might be worth 4 or 5 points. So for the same amount of effort, they are given more points to allow them to catch up. From a design perspective, I think this actually makes sense. I don't really have a problem with it. It allows both sides to be able to kind of even the scale out if one side ends up heavily, I guess, more populated than the other. And obviously, it would keep people playing the game. Now, if you win the Landsraad, you are given the option to choose one of 3 buffs, and depending on how much your guild contributes to the overall effort for that week, should you win, those points are able to be allocated toward voting for one of those 3 things. The more effort you put in, the more points you get to put toward a vote. For our first week, we ended up finishing 2nd overall in the Landsraad, and when we won, we were able to put our points in whatever one we chose, which equated to roughly 1/3 of the overall point total for whatever it was that we were going to vote for. We moved the needle a lot. These buffs, by the way, can range all over the place, from gaining 50% more experience for the entire week, to gaining access to either a weapons or an armor or a vehicle vendor that gives you tier 6 level gear that you buy with Solari, by the way. You don't need anything special, it's literally just the money in game. There's even an option where somebody can vote, if the vote were to win, where you can make the PvP full loot for the entire week. So instead of losing some durability, you actually drop everything. Needless to say, I would imagine Deep Desert would be relatively empty that following week. That or people would just be piloting vehicles naked. Either way, that would definitely change the landscape for a while. The control points usually don't generate very many points. It's like 10 points per minute that it's held. And honestly, if it were me, I feel like Funcom should probably revamp that a little bit and make it a little bit more enticing to really want control of it. Not to mention the fact that once the control point is held by your faction, you can't get it to flip for you so that you get point totals accumulated in your favor. Because each one of the NPC vendors, depending on your personal contribution, up to a 14,000 point total, has very special and specific things that you can get from them, like color swatches for your light armor, which is what this color swatch that I have on my gear is from. House Spinette has this charcoaly brown color swatch for your gear, but you have to hand in 14,000 points worth of a thing yourself. So unfortunately, in the long term, it doesn't really feel, not very often anyway, like the PvP is worth pursuing. Unless, of course, you just got that bloodlust. When you are able to find that base of 3 or 4 or 5 people that you're trying to call out to come and fight you, or you're shooting them down as they're taking off from places, or catching people unawares, it's actually really fun and engaging. You find that right guild that's got a few guys, maybe 5 to 8 to 10, and they start calling in their buddies, and that starts turning into like guild v guild wars. That stuff is actually really fun. And for all of the bugs that exist in the PvP system right now, and the imbalance issues and all these other things that I've just been talking about, getting into those fights feels great when you're able to get into them. Now, this, of course, is coming from the perspective of somebody that really fiends for and wants PvP all the time, especially because, for the most part, me and the guys that I play with kind of know what we're doing, and we tend to win a whole lot more often than we lose. But if I am being honest, right now in the game, PvP, by far, is the weakest aspect of this game. If I were to rate, let's say, each thing, the voice acting, 9 out of 10. The story of the game, 9 out of 10. The environment, the audio quality, the music, the immersive nature of the game, the honoring of the lore of the game, the accuracy of the lore of the game, the writing associated with the story itself, the behavior and mannerisms of the worm, the base building, the survival mechanics that are baked in, the flight physics, the vehicle usage, the idea behind materials and how they get built, the skill system, the tiers of the trees for all of the things that you learn along the way, and the way that they've tiered out the materials and how you progress through the map itself, the usefulness of all of the gadgets and weapons, etc., etc. All of that stuff is like 8, 9, and 10 out of 10. It's all way up there. But the PvP in this game right now feels like an afterthought. If you took this game and treated it as a PvE adventure RPG around a whole bunch of other people, like you were playing Minecraft on a public server, this game will keep you entertained for at least 100 hours. There is absolutely that much stuff to explore. But the end game, centralized around this giant PvP zone, while it is very, very cool from a tech perspective and from a point of interest perspective and the idea behind the creation of the Deep Desert and what it's supposed to be from a vision board standpoint, if you want to put it that way, falls very, very short of the mark, unfortunately. The first few times that you venture out and the first time that you go with a giant crew to try and amass a ton of spice sand and you have to defend it and think that there's going to be all of this crazy PvP fighting and you got all that nervousness, only to be, sorely disappointed for the most part because nothing really happened. Or you realize how much time went into amassing the materials that you needed in order to be able to get to that point in the first place. You start to realize the larger issue in this game is that after the point in time that you reach and generate Plastanium stuff, if there aren't enough people in Deep Desert adventuring around, there really isn't much else to do after that. My largest concern for the entire player base, and I'm not going to sugarcoat this whatsoever because I've said this even to the developers myself, is that in the long term of this game, meaning what happens after the people have graduated into Deep Desert to decide whether or not it's something they want to continue to play or not, is that the carrot for late game isn't going to be big enough to keep people engaged to want to keep pursuing it. Like, the unique blueprints that come out of some of these places are really, really good. But what is the point of having them if there isn't anybody to use them against? If I'm flying around in the best ornithopter that I can make with the money that I have, or the materials that I have farmed, I guess I should say, and that ornithopter takes me a good 10 minutes just to drop my target, even if they are in gear that is a tier or two less than what it is that I'm flying, I don't know if that's something I'm going to want to keep doing day in and day out. If it were me, if I were one of the devs, I would be trying to put a team together or teams of people together to try to flesh out very extensive systems as much as I possibly could, and more content, again, as much as I possibly could, in as relatively a short amount of time as I possibly could, in order to keep people engaged for the end game. Because while the numbers look amazing now, at the end of the day, Dune is a live service game, and the running hitch with live service games is always whether or not they can retain their player base after that first 100 or 200 hour shot of playtime. And right now, I worry that Dune doesn't have that, and they could end up going the way of what New World saw. I know that sounds like a lot of dooming, and I don't want it to sound like the game isn't good, because it is. It's really, really good. Overall, this is like an 8.5 or a 9 out of 10 for me. It's been a great time. But like anything else, when it comes to things like this that feel great, I want it to stay feeling great for as long as possible. I would love nothing more than to have the Sands of Arrakis be my home, at least as a gamer, for the foreseeable future. But it is absolutely up to the devs to keep people like myself and all of the other players out there engaged past the point in time that they've experienced a little deep desert run or 3. Because let's be honest, no one wants to see their player base numbers drop off the way that the viewer counts do in a video like this one by the time that you've gotten to this point in the video.